The day before my wedding, my mother came into my room. She sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I had slept in since I was 4 years old, the same quilt my grandmother had stitched from scraps of our old dresses, and she folded her hands in her lap the way she always did when she was about to say something important. I was 18 years old. In 14 hours, I would be a wife. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Be a good helper to him. Submit, as the church teaches. God will bless your obedience." And then she stood up, smoothed her apron, and walked out of the room. That was it. That was all of it. That was every word I was given before the most frightening night of my life. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Indiana, and this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If you want to hear more hidden truths like this one, subscribe right now and tap the like button. And in the comments tell me, did anyone ever prepare you for something you had absolutely no idea how to face? I read every single one. Now, let me tell you what that conversation with my mother actually contained. Because it is only now, years later, with a therapist and a dictionary of words I was never given, that I can name what it was. It was not preparation. It was instruction for endurance. There is a difference. And that difference cost me more than I can explain in a single video. In Old Order Amish communities, the days before a wedding are consumed entirely by practical work. The cooking starts 3 days out. In my community in Indiana, a wedding meant feeding anywhere from 200 to 300 people. My aunts had been at our house since Tuesday. There were chickens to dress, pies to roll, tables to borrow from every family within a mile radius. The barn had to be set up. The benches from the church wagon had to be arranged. My dress had been finished for 2 weeks, hanging behind the bedroom door in a cotton bag, a deep burgundy because we did not wear white. In all of that preparation, in all the days of cooking and cleaning and organizing and laundering and borrowed tablecloths and pressed aprons, not one single hour was set aside to prepare me for what would happen when the door of our bedroom finally closed. Not 1 hour, not one conversation, not one sentence beyond what my mother gave me that night on the edge of my bed. Be a good helper. Submit. God will bless your obedience. I want you to understand something about the theology underneath those words because this matters. In my community, a wife's body was not discussed as something that had its own experience. It was discussed as a function. It existed for procreation. It existed to serve. The idea that it might need something, preparation, information, even just an acknowledgement that what was coming might be frightening, that idea was never part of the conversation, because to have that conversation would have been to admit that a woman's physical experience of marriage was something worth considering. And in my church district, it simply was not. The Ordnung, our unwritten code that governed every aspect of daily life, did not address intimacy. Not formally. There was no ruling that said, "Do not tell brides what to expect." There did not need to be. The silence was so complete, so unanimous, that it functioned the same as law. No one spoke. No one ever had spoken. And so no one did. I learned this later, in therapy, sitting across from a woman who kept asking me to go back and describe what I had known going into that night. And each time I described it, which was almost nothing, she would write something down, and I would watch her face stay carefully neutral, and I would understand from her neutrality that what I was describing was not normal, not outside, not in the world I had come to live in. What I knew was this. I knew that marriage involved something physical between a husband and wife. I knew this because the Ordnung existed around it, because courtship had rules that implied there was something to protect against. I knew that the purpose of this physical thing was children, because children were what God sent to a faithful marriage, and children were what you spent the rest of your life raising. What I did not know could fill a book. I did not know what my own body would do. I did not know that fear would make everything worse. I did not know that there was a spectrum between what I had been told, which was nothing, and what I was about to experience, which was everything. I did not know that my husband, who was 22 years old and had grown up in the same silence I had, would be almost as uninformed as I was. I did not know that two people could be standing at the edge of something enormous and have absolutely nothing to hold on to. My husband's name was Joseph. He was a good man. He is a good man. I want to be clear about this the way I have had to be clear about it in therapy, because it is easy when you are telling a story like this one to let the man become the shape of everything that went wrong. Joseph was not the shape of everything that went wrong. Joseph was 22 years old and he had been handed the same silence I had, and he was doing his best inside of it. And so was I, and that is the most heartbreaking part of all of it. We were both trying. We just had nothing to try with. What I remember about the wedding night itself is not the tenderness people imagine. It is not the romance. I remember the lamp. I remember that my hands would not stop shaking when I unpinned my hair. I remember that I did not know what I was supposed to do first or second or at all, and that I was so exhausted from 17 hours of cooking and smiling and receiving the blessings of 300 people that I could barely stand, and that underneath the exhaustion was something colder, something I could not name at 18, but can name now, dread. Not dread of Joseph, dread of the unknown, dread of a thing I had no map for. And here is what I wish I could go back and tell that girl sitting on the edge of the bed with shaking hands. I wish I could tell her what was coming, even just the outline of it. Even just, this is what your body will do. This is what is normal. This is what is not. Even just words. Even imperfect words. Even a conversation that was clumsy and halting and left out half of what it should have said. I would have taken anything. I would have taken a single sentence that acknowledged I was a person with a body that was about to have an experience, and that the experience was allowed to matter. My friend Rebecca was married at 17, 1 year before me. I did not know until 4 years after my wedding that she had spent the first months of her marriage in a confusion so complete it had begun to feel like illness. She thought something was wrong with her. She thought her struggle meant she lacked faith. She confided this to me in her kitchen, in a whisper, while her youngest was sleeping in the next room, and when she finished I told her what I had begun to understand by then, that there was nothing wrong with her faith. There was something wrong with the silence. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down, 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about the morning after. I woke before dawn, the way I had every morning of my life. The house was quiet. Joseph was still sleeping. I lay there for a moment in the gray light, in this bed that was now my bed, in this house that was now my house, in this life that was now irrevocably my life. And I waited to feel something that matched what I had been promised. Wholeness, completion, the peace that comes from walking in obedience. What I felt instead was alone and confused, and quietly, privately, ashamed. Not because anything had been done wrong, but because no one had told me what right was supposed to feel like, and so I had no way of knowing whether what had happened was what was supposed to have happened. I had no baseline. I had no framework. I had nothing to hold the experience against except the bishop's sermons about yielding and the memory of my mother's hands folded in her lap, and neither of those things had prepared me for what a body actually feels. I got up, I put on my dress, I started the stove, I fed the animals. I moved through the morning in silence because silence was the only language available to me, and I told myself, this is what faithfulness looks like. This is the beginning of the life God intended. I believed that for a long time. Longer than I should have. The women in my community were not cruel. I want to say this too because it is also true. My mother was not withholding the information because she wanted me to suffer. She was withholding it because she had been withheld from too, and her mother before her, and hers before that. And the silence had passed down through the women of my family the way the quilt patterns passed down, stitch by stitch, generation by generation, without anyone stopping to ask whether the pattern still served the person wearing it. The older women in my community had their own version of the underground knowledge. I learned this later. There was a woman, a neighbor, older than my mother, who had a reputation for saying things sideways. At quilting bees, she would sometimes make a comment that landed differently on the married women than on the girls. A sentence about patience. A sentence about what a body learns over time. The married women would hear it and look at each other briefly, a kind of recognition. I was not married yet, and I did not understand. I understood later. But I was not one of the ones she pulled aside before my wedding. I do not know why. I was not among the chosen ones who received even the sideways version. That is luck. That is how arbitrary it was. Some women received a jar passed over a fence. Some women received a single sentence at a quilting bee. Some women received nothing. And the difference between receiving something and receiving nothing was not character. It was not faith. It was not worthiness. It was proximity. It was timing. It was whether the right woman happened to look at you in the right moment and decide you were the one she would risk the silence for. I was not that one. And so I learned alone. Slowly. Over months that did not need to be as hard as they were. Over mornings I rose from in quiet pain I had been told was holiness. Over conversations with Joseph that did not happen for a long time because I did not have the words for them. And then when I finally had the words, I had to build the courage to use them too. That conversation, when it finally happened, was one of the hardest things I have ever done. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the evening, the lamp between us, and I told him that I had been struggling, that I had not known what to expect, that there were things I needed that I had not known how to ask for. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I didn't know I was allowed to." He looked at me for a moment, and I watched something move across his face. Not anger, something closer to sorrow. He said, "I didn't know either. I didn't know what you needed because no one ever told me what to ask." We sat in that kitchen for a long time, the horses shifting in the barn, the clock on the wall. Two people in their 20s who had been married for over a year, finally beginning, very slowly, to speak to each other about the thing that had been present in our house every day and had never once been named. That conversation happened because of us. Not because of anything the community gave us. We had to build it ourselves, out of the scraps of courage we had left after years of learning that asking was dangerous and silence was holy. After I left, and the leaving was its own story, the shunning, the letters returned, my mother's voice on the phone going quiet in a way I will never stop hearing. I found a therapist who worked with women from closed communities. She asked me once, "If you could change one thing about your preparation for marriage, what would it be?" I did not hesitate. I said, I would want someone to tell me the truth, not to protect me from it, not to dress it in scripture so it became about obedience instead of about me. Just the truth. What is coming? What your body will do. What is normal. What help looks like. What you are allowed to want. She wrote something down. Then she looked up and said, "Do you know what's interesting about that? You didn't say you wanted someone to make it easier. You just wanted someone to make it true." I have thought about that almost every day since. The title of this video says, "I wish someone had lied to me." And I want to tell you now what I mean by that, because I owe you the honesty of it. I do not actually wish someone had lied. What I wish is that the truth had come to me in a gentler shape. I wish someone had sat on the edge of my bed the night before my wedding and told me, "This will be hard, and that is allowed. Your fear is not faithlessness. Your body is not something to be gotten through. You are allowed to not know. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to need things. That is not a lie. That is also not what my mother said to me. Be a good helper. Submit. God will bless your obedience. Those words were true in the world she lived in. But they were not the whole truth. And the part they left out is the part that cost me years. If you grew up in a place where your body was handed to a life before you understood what your body was, I see you. If you were given obedience instead of information and told the two things were the same, you are not alone. If you woke up on a morning you had been told would feel like a blessing and felt instead like a question you had no language for, I believe you. And I want you to know the question was real. The language just hadn't been given to you yet. You were allowed to need more than silence. You always were. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video, and that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.